Okay, everyone. So hello and welcome, and thank you all for joining. Today's webinar is going to focus on the SEC's new modernized marketing rule for registered investment advisors. Today, we're going to go over the obligations of the rule. We're going to share some insights with you on compliance, and hopefully we're going to provide a few other helpful pieces of information along the way. Now, today's webinar is being hosted by Kaufman Rawson, a large full-service public accounting and consulting firm, and we are very, very excited to be co-hosting this event with Jute, a leading provider of technology solutions for registered investment advisors and other financial services firms as well. So my name is Alex Egan, and I am a manager in our risk advisory group at Kaufman Rawson, where I help to lead our regulatory and compliance practice focused on the needs of broker-dealers and registered investment advisors, and where many of my colleagues focus on money services businesses, banks, and other types of regulated financial institutions. So I'm very excited to introduce both of our speakers today, but before I do, we all just wanted to say thank you. Really thank you to the hundreds of attendees who registered to attend this event from across the country and really across the industry. Obviously, we are very, very excited at that level of turnout. And clearly, this is a very hot topic. So I promise we will try our very, very best not to disappoint. So I'm going to introduce both of our speakers today. First, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Ashley Ehrenman. Now, Ashley is another manager in our group that provides services to both broker-dealer and RIA clients. Now, Ashley has been with Kaufman Rawson for several years now, but she has particular expertise dealing with the marketing and communication obligations of RIAs. In fact, when I first came to the firm, having spent so much time under the broker-dealer framework, I would often go to her for guidance on any complex issues around marketing and communications involving the SEC, which I always found impressive because, unlike FINRA, where you have one clear rule and maybe some related obligations, as many of you know, the SEC's prior framework was all over the place with dozens of guidance documents, no action letters, various rules, and that often made it, difficult to get a handle on. But somehow I could always show Ashley a piece and she would be able to say, no, that statement is not allowed, or wait, because we've said this, we need to add this specific disclosure, and could actually cite why. And I just think that level of background knowledge is going to go a very long way in advising firms on the best way to implement some of these changes going forward. So thank you, Ashley. Welcome. I'm also very excited to introduce Bo Howell. Bo is the CEO of Jute, and actually I came across Bo through a veteran connection. I can tell you, having been in this industry for many years now, it is very rare that I come across another veteran. So when I do, I always make an effort to reach out. And in this case, I'm very glad I did, because in addition to Bo being a veteran, he's also a securities attorney. He's done his time at the SEC as well as time with other financial institutions, and just has a ton of experience to share. Plus, as the CEO of Jute, we're also very, very excited to get his insights on leveraging technology to help meet some of these compliance expectations going forward. So again, thank you both, Ashley and Bo, for joining us. So let's briefly touch on the agenda. So today we're going to give you a little bit of background on the rule and where it came from. As the title of this webinar suggests, we're going to tell you some potential advantages and why advisors may be looking to implement these changes sooner rather than later. And then we'll go into the actual rule and break out different components and take a closer look at what this rule really requires. And then towards the end, we'll start talking about different ways we're seeing advisors leverage technology to help meet some of these compliance expectations. And of course, we'll give you a bit more on both Jute and Kaufman Rawson and some ways we may be able to help. So do keep in mind, as we provide, this webinar today, if we're giving training one-on-one to an advisor, we can quite easily spend 3 or 4 hours digging into all the different nuanced components and exceptions to the rule. We've tried to trim things down for you to about an hour, So the purpose of this is to give you at least a high level understanding of the rule, so that when you walk away today, you can anticipate what your next steps should be for your firm or your advisor going forward. Now, we imagine as we work our way through, you are going to have questions. So feel free to use that Q&A icon. Click on that and submit any questions. And somebody from this panel will be really happy to follow up with you after the webinar and work through that. Also, as we work our way through, you are going to see several polling questions populate. Listen, we really encourage you to respond to those. It provides great industry insights and sort of gives us all the opportunity to see what our peers may be thinking. So speaking of polls, to kind of kick things off, I wanted to share with you a poll that we took leading up to this webinar. Specifically, we asked everyone on LinkedIn whether or not they intended to implement the changes of this new marketing rule right away, whether they were looking to sort of kick the ball down and do it down the road and do it at the last possible moment, or if they were unsure. And perhaps not surprisingly so, 20% of you said, yes, I want to do it right away. Another 20% said that you were looking to do it at the last possible moment. But the majority of you, about 60%, had said you were still unsure. So Ashley, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you could go into the rule and the obligations and what it requires, but perhaps before you do, just kind of touch on the background of the rule, where it came from, and talk about what some of those advantages look like and why an advisor may be looking to implement these changes sooner rather than later.
Absolutely, Alex. Thank you so much. So let's start by talking about where did this rule come from. These are the first substantive amendments to the advertising and solicitation rules since 1961 and 1979, respectively. And I want to take a moment to put that into perspective for you. My mom was born in 1962 and she has a grandchild. So we now have 3 generations who were not born during some of the last changes to this rule. That shows you how out of date some of these items may have appeared. In addition, the SEC has recognized that there's been so many different changes to technology, social media, and the expectations of investors. Think about also how the industry has changed since the 1960s and the 1970s. It was time that the SEC had done an update. Next slide. So, why should we act now? Well, we have 18 months to complete implementation starting on May 4th, 2021. But the better question I have for you is, why shouldn't we act now? We all know that the summer is generally a very quiet time for advisors, as many of our clients are out on vacation. They're answering emails for work, but they're not necessarily doing things that they may be doing at year end. In addition, there are so many changes under the new advertising rule that we believe could be advantageous to various business models for different advisory practices. It does not matter how you operate your business, there is something in that rule that is good for you. We can now talk about things like performance portability, third-party ratings, testimonials, endorsements, and all other types of items that we previously could not do. Next slide. Let's actually take a moment to talk about the updated advertising rule. The SEC updated the definition of the advertising rule as well as grouped the information into 2 prongs. And let's take a moment to go through what those 2 prongs are at a high level. Prong 1 relates to traditional advertisements as we know them. Prong 2 relates to testimonials and endorsements. And something to note is that prong 2 replaces the old solicitation rule. Now, today's rule is going to focus on testimonials, endorsements, third-party ratings, and performance. However, I want to note the new rule just doesn't stop there. There is so much more in that new rule. And like Alex had said, I'm pretty sure everyone on this panel today could spend 3 or 4 hours just going through different subjects on the rule. So if we think of the new marketing rule as the ocean, today we're going to study a few fish. We're not going to go into the sand, the ecosystem. We're just going to look at a few specific fish that live in that ocean. Next slide, please. But let's take a moment and talk about the general prohibitions of the rule. The SEC has given us 7 items that we absolutely cannot do. And at Kaufman-Rawson, we like to refer to these items as the 7 deadly sins of the marketing rule. Now, you're going to say, well, what are these 7 deadly sins? They're all common sense, straightforward items. The SEC went into a lot of detail into the rule. However, at a high level, they're the things that you and I think of. Let's not materially mislead a client. Let's not use untrue statements of fact. Let's not have any untrue omissions. Put things in that we can't substantiate if the SEC were to ask. Not disclosing material risks, that's a big one. And making sure, if you include investment advice, it has to be in a fair and balanced manner. So we should never include anything that's not fair and balanced in our advertising materials. In addition, we shouldn't include or exclude performance results in a manner that's not fair and balanced. And we'll get into that word fair and balanced in a few slides. But generally, we just don't want things that are going to be materially misleading in our slides. So now that we talked about what you can't do, I want to actually talk about the updated definition of an advertisement on the next slide. The SEC has now redefined an advertisement. And one of the things that you are going to note in this definition is they talk about hypothetical performance. In addition, they talk about communications with one or more person, or more than one person. So let's take a moment and digest this. Take a few seconds and let that sink in. Under this rule, when we are talking about more than one person, or one or more persons, one-on-one presentations are excluded. That item that you are showing to the client must be unique as of that moment in time. In addition, if you have a company sitting at your table and there's 5 people from that company in front of you, that company and those 5 people are considered to be one person under this rule. If you have 5 family members from the same household sitting at your table, that is considered to be one person for this rule. If you have an advertising piece that, yes, you have one person from one family in front of you, but you use that piece over and over and over again, that is considered to be an advertisement. Now, the key here that we need to note is that the SEC's rule talks a lot about advising services being offered. So if you are having an item like a white paper, that is not an advertisement as long as you do not talk about your advertising pieces. If you're using general commentary on asset classes, market or regulatory updates that don't talk about your advisory services, that is not considered an advertisement under the rule. However, if you do include a portion about your advisory services, that is going to be considered an advertisement. And now I want to go into prong 1. We said that the advertising rule has many things it includes, but we know that it also has some exclusions. And like we had said, those are some one-on-one communications. So if a client picks up the phone and says, hey, do you have 5 minutes for me? I got a quick question. I want to ask you about this, this, and this. That is not an advertisement. In addition, if it is a true live, extemporaneous oral communication, like a TV interview where you do not have the questions in advance and you cannot prepare, and someone is truly asking you for the very first time a question, that is not an advertisement. If you have the ability to pre-prep your answers, you get your questions in advance, you can formally document what you want to say, that is going to be considered an advertisement. Now, what about things like your Form ADV filing? We'll talk about some changes to the Form ADV later. However, I want you to know a regulatory item, like updating your Form ADV to answer the questions we're going to discuss, that is not considered an advertisement under the new rule. In addition, hypothetical performance under various circumstances is not going to be considered an advertisement. And we'll get into hypothetical performance in a couple slides. Prong 2 has to do with testimonials, endorsements, and promoters. And promoters are those people that we used to call solicitors. So some of this in the next few slides is going to sound very familiar, and it really should. Now, something new about Prong 2 is it explicitly discusses cash and non-cash compensation. Previously, we had seen cash and non-cash compensation spread out across various no action letters, but now we have it in one unified spot. I do want to note a few items that we need to note before we go into the specifics for Prong 2. And some of the exemptions that we had talked about under Prong 1 don't always apply to Prong 2. But that, again, is another 20, 30-minute conversation in itself. So I'm going to save those for a different day. Let's talk about facts and circumstances. We see all over this new advertising rule the phrase facts and circumstances. And what is the SEC really trying to get at? Well, we'll get into the nitty-gritty later, but we should note that at a very high level, marketing items should consider the sophistication of the target audience, and all of the disclosures should be considered and tailored for that target audience. Further, the SEC noted in the release of the new rule that there are no pre-use and approval requirements. So, what does that mean? We need to make sure that the advisory practice has robust policies and procedures reasonably designed to prevent a violation of this rule. Now, let's talk about testimonials, endorsements, and third-party ratings. And based off the SEC's definition of a testimonial, I can pretty much guess or guarantee that you're going to be able to guess the definition of an endorsement. A testimonial is a statement by a current client or private fund investor about their experience with the advisory practice. So let's say JLo is your client and you say, hey, JLo, can you tell people what you think about us? Guess what? That's a testimonial. But with that, I want you to guess what an endorsement is if a testimonial is a statement from a current client. An endorsement is a statement by a non-investor or current client. So this would be A-Rod. You go out, you hire A-Rod, you say, hey, A-Rod, I know you've never worked with me before, but please, can you do me a favor and talk a little bit about our advisory practice? That's going to be an endorsement. In addition, the SEC has very specific disclosure requirements for testimonials and endorsements. And Alex, I know we had just talked about these the other day, but based off our conversation, I think I could personally spend at least another lunch hour, maybe two, talking about that. So what do you think about that? Maybe we'll save that one for a different point.
Absolutely. We could probably save that for an entire day. But certainly as you talk about those things, the testimonials, endorsements, and third-party ratings, these things that we think about as being new that we're allowed to do now, right? That we weren't allowed to do before. We talked about this sort of leading up to the webinar, and you mentioned it briefly, when you open. There's probably a lot of advisors out there that might be thinking to themselves, you know what, I've never really gone down this route before because it wasn't allowed. I wasn't using third-party ratings, so I'm really not eager to sort of jump into this stuff now. But you really have to ask yourself if you can afford to wait, because what happens if we get 6 months into this and the use of third-party ratings, the use of paid endorsements and testimonials just really takes off and allows your competition to gain a competitive edge in terms of marketing and the ability to solicit and retain clients, right? By the time you realize that you need to get on board and start doing this, you might be a year late to the party, which could end up being a costly mistake.
I fully agree, Alex. And that's one of the reasons why I think implementing sooner rather than later is the right way to go. In addition, not that I'm a celebrity biased, but I think some of our big celebrities like A-Rod might be taken if you wait. And that's just my personal thoughts. I live in the Tampa region and we just won the Super Bowl. And I'm pretty sure Tom Brady will be taken #1 for any sports fans out there. So I definitely recommend acting sooner rather than later. That's just my personal preference though. Now, let's go into third-party ratings. And there's something that we should talk about with third-party ratings. The person providing a third-party rating for your advisory practice that will be part of your advertising material cannot be related to the advisor. In addition, this is what this entity or this person must do as part of the ordinary course of business. So unfortunately, I can't hire my brother-in-law to send out a survey to say how much people like me if I'm in advisory practice. And I know that sounds a little silly and something that most advisors would say, well, obviously, but the SEC found it important enough to make sure that they define that it's not a related person and this is what they do for their ordinary course of business. We're going to get into the conditions of testimonials, endorsements, and third-party ratings a little bit more now, but third-party ratings will come in about just 2 to 3 slides. And now we're going to launch a polling question. Our question says, do you plan on incorporating testimonials and endorsements into your marketing program? And there's some very specific conditions I want to talk about with respect to testimonials and endorsements in prong 2. Like we said, prong 2 replaces the cash solicitation rule. And further, the rule generally prohibits any testimonial or endorsement from someone who's considered to be a disqualified person. These are people who are ineligible because of a disqualifying commission action or a disqualifying event. And that, I think that makes sense to most of us. Depending on the list of the SEC's disqualifying events, you could look at it and say, yeah, I don't know if I really want that person talking about my advisory practice. But the SEC also spent a lot of time talking about written agreements. And this is going to sound extremely similar to your solicitor agreement and solicitor disclosure document that you may already be familiar with if you do have solicitors in place. The SEC says that an advisor must have a new written agreement that describes the scope of the agreed upon activities. It sets forth the term of the compensation for those activities, including cash, non-cash compensation, indirect compensation, compensation in general. And the agreement should be created to allow the advisor to perform a reasonable basis for believing that the endorsement by that promoter will follow the marketing rule. And now we have our polling results in. It looks like about 40% of people say yes, they will include testimonials and endorsements in their program. 35 are not sure, and 25 say no. So let's talk about some exemptions. There are various different exemptions for testimonials and endorsements. And again, this is something that I could spend another hour talking about, so I'm going to hit them at a very high level. De minimis compensation under the testimonials and endorsement section is considered to be compensation that is $1,000 or less. In some of these circumstances, if you're giving less than $1,000 in terms of compensation, you're not subject to the disqualification provision or the written agreement. You're still subject to disclosure and oversight requirements, though. For affiliated personnel, this is an endorsement made by an employee or an affiliate and is not subject to the disclosure requirements or written agreement requirement, but you still have to follow the disqualification or general oversight requirements. In addition, registered broker-dealers and persons related to 506 securities offerings have their own set of exemptions. And honestly, like I said, there's so much in here I actually want to go over. I don't have the time to go into the nitty-gritty on this today, so I think we'll leave this slide here. For third-party ratings, we had talked about how they could be used, and we have our next polling question of, do you plan on using a third-party rating agency? Well, if we're going to use this agency, we must have a reasonable basis to believe that the questions that are being asked don't push our client to answer one way or another. But how do we actually do this? We can try to obtain a copy of the survey that was used, but sometimes that entity might not want to provide it to you. So what can we do? We can do due diligence on the entity. We can inquire with the entity about the type of questions that are being used. Are they using questions like, yes, I love this as responses, or is it a 1 through 10 scale? Or is it yes, no, maybe? How are they asking those questions, and does it push anyone any specific way? But something we want to do is move on to the subject we've all been waiting for, and that is performance. And here is our response for the third-party rating agencies. And it seems that most people say no, they don't plan on using one. So like I said, let's move into performance. And the presentation of performance has had a complete overhaul. It is still considered to be a very high risk for the SEC. And the SEC doesn't have separate rule requirements for retail and non-retail customers when it comes to performance. So one of the things that we must note now is if we're going to present gross performance, we must also present net performance. And net performance must be presented with at least equal prominence and calculated over the same time period using the same type of return methodology. Further, now we have to show our performance over 1, 5, and 10-year periods. So I already know what question you're going to have right off the bat. What if I don't have performance for a 10-year period? What if I only have it for 2 years? Well, then we're going to show a 1-year and 2-year performance period. What if I have it for 6 years? A 1, 5, and 6-year period will satisfy this requirement. You can show more time periods other than the 1, 5, and 10-year times, but you must at a minimum show the 1, 5, and 10-year period if the item you have that performance for that long. With respect to related performance, the presentation of related performance also has to do with related portfolios. So what are we talking about with the related portfolio? It's a portfolio that's extremely similar in nature. It's going to have the same investment policies, same investment objectives, strategies. Should really be, if you're looking at a hamburger, it should be a clone. So related performance shows all of those related portfolios. And we have to be careful though, if we have 100 related portfolios and we choose only to include 80 in our calculation. We can only leave those 20 out if our results aren't going to materially change or be higher or lower if all those related portfolios had been included. We also still have to show our 1, 5, and 10-year requirements And if anything is going to change the presentation of those 1, 5, and 10-year requirements, we have to leave that in. Moving into hypothetical performance. So hypothetical performance is really important. And one of the key things I want to stress is that the advisor must have policies and procedures in place surrounding that hypothetical performance. We need to make sure that any type of hypothetical performance that we're presenting is relevant to our intended audience, and it reflects the same financial situation and investment objective of that audience. But how do we know what that is for someone who's just coming to sit at our table for the very first time? Well, the SEC has said that we can use our past experience with other investors to make that judgment call. We also want to make sure that there's enough information to allow our intended audience to understand the criteria that we use and the risks that we have around hypothetical performance. Now, let's move into performance relating to investment tools. What about these? How do we know? Is this performance? Is this not? Is this an advertisement? The SEC has said that performance generated by an investment tool is not considered to be hypothetical performance. There are certain disclosures that must be included, and we've included those 4 disclosures on the screen. Now, what I want to say is when it comes to disclosures, that is a whole different animal. I could honestly spend hours talking about disclosures alone. And I think that's going to be an area that a lot of people are going to get tripped up on because there's so many nitty-gritty little items in disclosures. So I think when it comes to disclosures, we'll definitely talk about that at a later point on a different date. But I want to end our conversation on performance talking about something that everyone seems very, very interested in. And every client that I've spoken to says, wow, I really want this and I want to do this now. And that's performance portability. Performance portability means that we can talk about our performance at a past advisory practice, which I think is a very, very big deal. And I think this is what a lot of registered investment advisors will start doing. But when is it actually allowed? There are very specific circumstances, and there are a few things that we should know. First, the person or group of people who are responsible for that performance must be at the current advisory practice that is going to advertise that performance. So if there was a grouping of 10 people and 2 of which came over and they are not the people responsible for the general performance, you cannot advertise that. In addition, the accounts must be managed very similarly between the 2 practices. The accounts have to be similar in nature. In addition, the accounts, when they're being managed, really have to be very generally done the same way. You must have clear and prominent disclosures talking about the results. And honestly, you have to disclose, according to the rule, that they were managed at a different entity. You can't present them as if they're your results at this current entity where you are. So let's talk about some other important items. And now that we've talked about the good stuff, I think it's actually time that we talk about changes to Form ADV. The Form ADV Part 1 is now going to have an updated section of marketing, where you're going to have to answer a few yes or no activities or yes or no questions about your advertising and marketing and things in general. But when do we actually need to update our Form ADV? If you're a late adopter, it's going to be with the annual amendment after the compliance date of the rule. So if you wait till the very, very end, till there's 1 or 2 months left to adopt, you're going to amend your ADV after the compliance date of the new rule with your annual amendment. If you adopt early, you're going to do your annual amendment after you have adopted compliance with the rule. So if you adopt this summer, you will do it with your next ADV amendment. In addition, we should talk about books and records. We do have a poll question launching as well. The books and records rule has also changed. It has been updated to match the new marketing rule, include internal written and recorded materials, performance rate of return, internal documents, and supporting records for performance. So essentially, there's a lot of new things that the SEC's new marketing rule says that we need to obtain. In this new books and records rule, we really need to make sure that we are maintaining the appropriate books and records to comply with any of the new provisions we may enact. In addition, something that we should talk about is that you do have to have documentation of communication relating to your predecessor performance. We need to talk about who our intended audience is, how we kind of got to that point, how we're going to show compliance with testimonials and endorsements and surveys. And honestly, even books and records, I feel like is a subject that, Alex, I don't know about you, but this is another one where I could just spend hours. Many of the people who know me know I like to get into the nitty gritty and I'm very detail oriented. So before we actually get into those nitty gritties at a different point, let's actually reveal the results of our poll results. So most people think the biggest hurdle when implementing the new rule will be becoming comfortable what is and what is not allowed, which I completely understand. 40% say implementing the new rule all at once because the SEC has said that you cannot adopt portions of the rule. It is an all or nothing approach. 26% said updating policies and procedures. And I can see how that would be quite daunting based off the number of changes. And 19% said training employees on the new rule. So now that we've gone through the marketing rule and just looked at a couple fish in the ocean, I think it's time that we pass this over to Bo with some technology solutions.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I appreciate that. Listen, certainly a lot there for advisors to be thinking about. And as you go through, every section, I can certainly see how a lot of advisors might be thinking that, only certain components may be applicable to them, and they may want to ask additional questions. So certainly stay tuned as we get to the end of the presentation. We'll dive into some additional resources for you going forward if you do have those additional questions. But yeah, it's a lot for advisors to be thinking about. Bo, yes, please, maybe you could spend a little time talking about, with all of these different obligations, how advisors may be looking to comply with all of these obligations.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Ashley. One of the things I imagine is going through a lot of people's minds right now are, okay, this is another SEC rule, right? I've got to wrap my head around it, and then I've got to implement it. And we know that takes time and effort. So now that we've kind of seen what the rule is going to permit you to do and think about where is the industry moving, I think it's a good idea to take a step back and look at where we're at today. So today, when you think of the advertising process within your advisory firm, a lot of advisors are still following what, very manual processes, right? They get a draft of some type of blog post or article, advertising piece, fact sheet, things like that. It gets circulated internally via email. Maybe there's a handful of people that need to review it and comment on it. You got issues with version controls. Have you documented everything in case the SEC comes in for an exam? And defaulting to, well, my emails were archived, so hopefully it got captured there. Probably not the best way to go, but that's what a lot of people are doing these days. Some people have adopted basic workflow tools. Jute has one of those tools. We know there are other tech firms out there that also have these process automation tools, and those can be helpful in the sense that they can reduce the amount of time and some of the risks like version control. Because they allow for sequencing of review, they allow for automation of commenting and approval, and they allow you to collaborate better where multiple people can work in a document at the same time. So that's helpful. And a lot of times those have audit trails too that can be helpful from a compliance perspective if you ever need to go back and look at what was changed, why was it changed, and do we have all the various versions. So today, as the technology exists, there is some process automation. But if we're talking about really ramping up the volume of advertising and the types of advertising out there, what we notice is there's a gap between the rule and what it allows you to do and the technology that exists for actually deploying the advertising. There's this technology gap in between. And so before we get on the next slide, our next poll here just kind of asks, how do you think the marketing rule is going to change your advertising strategy? Do you expect the amount of advertising we do to increase, stay the same? There's a couple of options here, and we'll give you a minute to answer the question. So while folks are finishing up the poll question, we'll see the results here in a second. One of the issues with our expectation is that most people are going to increase the amount of advertising that they're doing. Maybe not in the next 18 months as they wait for things to shake out. You'll have some early adopters and early movers, as Ashley mentioned, the reasons why you might want to do that. But it also sounds like, just based on the polling questions today, there's a lot of people who are going to be a little more cautious about this and wait for how things develop. And part of that's because changing things takes time and effort, right? And if you're a small to middle-sized firm, who's going to lead that effort? Who's going to take that charge? So if you look at the polling results here, a lot of you are kind of in the middle. We may produce more ads if you can kind of figure out how to manage this from a compliance perspective. And many of you, or some of you do expect to increase. So on par, we do expect, there to be an increase, but we've got this gap, right? How do we manage from where the rule is to where the tech is? So if you look at the slide here, the 3 issues with managing this expanded advertising rule, you're still going to need the 3 core things you've always needed. Somebody with expertise on the rule, someone who has that can make the effort to actually implement and review each piece, and that takes time. And so in order to really build a scalable advertising process, we need to address the expertise part, right? The process automation can address effort and time, make it a little bit faster, a little bit easier. But the expertise is still the biggest hurdle to overcome with technology. So if you look at where we're going, one of the trends we're seeing in advertising in general, even in our space, and particularly in other industries, is a lot more video content and smaller video content. And that creates challenges because textual pieces can be read fairly quickly. Some of the natural language processing that exists can review text very quickly, but video presents its own challenges. Machine learning and AI, and we'll talk about this in a bit, it's just not quite ready to digest a large amount of video to make sure that it's compliant. And we see that even outside the industry in places like YouTube, right? They have to hire people to watch videos and screen them because the technology is still catching up there. We do expect testimonials and reviews to increase. And the reason for that, and I think the early adopters are going to prove this, is generally speaking, just getting a few reviews and testimonials will have a direct impact on your business. So even if it's not something you've done before, if you look at the way consumers shop in other areas outside of financial services, they really value reviews. And they want to read about what other people's experiences are. That's a human nature. And so we do expect that to increase. But again, that's just going to stretch kind of the resources you have, particularly if you're a small to middle-sized advisor. So the next question we have kind of focuses on, how do you plan to handle compliance? So if you looked at the last question, a lot of you said, I may do more advertising, but it depends on whether we can bridge the compliance gap between the rule and actual deployment. And so here we have a few options, some of the more common options of how people might approach addressing a compliance gap. So we'll go ahead and give you a little bit of time here to answer the polling question and talk about the results afterwards. Alex, if you want to move on to the next slide. Great. So where are we going? And here's the answer to the question, right? A lot of you, in fact, I'm not surprised by this. 56% of you said, I'm going to have to read the requirements and handle the compliance myself. That either means you're a CCO or you're a partner at a small firm who got stuck with the CCO hat. So that doesn't surprise us there. The next biggest group is to engage a consultant. Again, that's what we would expect, right? Whenever there's a new rule out, if you're not sure you've got the internal expertise or the time and effort to meet the new requirements, bring in an expert, leverage them. Oftentimes that can be faster and easier and get you there, so that you can deploy even faster. So if we look at where we're going, what technology really needs to do is start to address that expertise portion, right? And if we look at the social media that exists today, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, none of these were designed for a regulated industry. None of them handle disclosure well. I mean, I talk with clients all the time about, hey, we want to do this or that post on this social media platform. How do I handle disclosures? I've got 6 footnotes I need to attach this piece. I've only got 160 characters, to publish this. How's that possible? So when you look at today's technology, it's just really not there. And I'm not sure that, your LinkedIn's and Facebook's and stuff, that they're going to, in the next 18 months, really make a push to kind of work with this type of regulated structure. So there's going to need to be some type of solution in between that bridges that gap. And that's where we're going with this. So we think, technology as it exists today, particularly with machine learning and some of the artificial intelligence models out there, are going to allow advisors to really ramp up and scale their advertising, to do a number of different things that we're going to talk about here in a moment, but to really make it easier, faster, and bring in that expertise. So what we're really talking about here over time is starting to digitize the expertise needed to comply with the rule, right? And that's a trend you generally see with any new rule coming out. Usually over time, there's technology that develops to address that rule, because that regulatory burden keeps increasing, but the size of your firm doesn't necessarily keep up with the number of rules. So we have our next polling question here, and this is really, one that I'm very interested in. As someone who's focused more and more on bringing technology solutions to the industry today, I'd love to hear what type of technology do you think would be most impactful for you in implementing this rule? We've given you some kind of options here to focus it, but this really gets to where do you find, based on your current resources, the biggest challenges to be internally? And the one thing I want to mention that is increasingly coming up with investors is the whole concept of data privacy, right? I mean, whenever we talk about leveraging more technology, and we've heard a lot in the news about data privacy and data issues, that's a conversation that more and more advisors are having to have with their customers. So I think whatever solution ends up coming out here, the data privacy and security around it is really important, particularly if it has some of your proprietary information. So as we look at the results of the polling question here, it looks like by a narrow margin, most of you would love a tool that would help you add specific disclosures. And that's something we actually think current machine learning models and natural language processing can do, because we can train those models to recognize certain speech and text patterns, and says, hey, look, if it looks like this, that with 99% certainty, they're going to need, this type of disclosure added to the piece. So that's something that we definitely think exists today and can be trained up in the models. But a very close second to that was ad review and compliance alerts. And there's no reason why today's models, whether it's a machine learning model that uses some type of deep neural network or other type of AI technology, can't kind of look at both the graphics and the text in an advertising piece and actually start to quantify some type of score. If nothing else, alert the CCO or whoever's responsible for looking at the advertising piece where there may be some issues in this document, right? It probably can't tell you every issue because technology is still struggling a little bit with context. But if it could at least start to give you some red or yellow flags that would allow you to zero in on certain pieces, that could make that review process even faster. And as I mentioned before, we do think that AI, which I'm using broadly to include machine learning, can help. We think, but in order to get there, we also need to develop trust between the industry and the technology that's coming out. You need to understand how the models behind the technology are made and built and how that's going to impact your fiduciary duty. You need to have comfort that the content being produced by the models is actually accurate. And so, it is going to be a bit of a ramp up period. I wish I could sit here today and say, there's a perfect solution out there for you. But much like the next 18 months, while you're learning about the rule, technology is always going to lag a little bit because technology firms like Jude need to see what and how people are actually applying the rule, right? How are they actually leveraging it and using it? Because that's going to drive the types of tools and techniques that we build. So here's just kind of at the end, to wrap things up here towards the end, where Jude sees things going forward, right? And it just kind of mirrors some of the polling questions we asked. But these are all things we think existing technology can help with, such as obviously keyword and graphic searches. There's been a lot of advancement, particularly on the graphic side. And when you look at advertising today, it's becoming more and more visual and less textual. We think that's a trend that's going to continue, and that's going to help advance some of these machine learning databases. The one problem with graphic searches is the technology still struggles with context, right? It can actually lift text out of an image to check it. It can identify certain things within the photo or the image, but stepping back and applying that human common sense context to the image. If somebody's holding up a sign that says, I guarantee your performance returns, but it's got a bunch of other noise in the image, that can struggle with models. But if the model can identify the word guaranteed in there and say, we're not sure if this is accurate or not, but UCCO should take a look at this photo, we're going to flag it for you. Now you're identifying a potential issue for the expert and making that process faster. I absolutely do think that adding ad-specific disclosure is something that you will see come out here in the next 12 to 18 months to address this rule. That's the type of technology that exists today in a lot of products. We talked about flagging potential issues and then also requiring supporting documentation. Some of the things that Ashley talked about, like with performance reporting and stuff, you're going to have the data behind that. And that's one thing that technology can do very well, is identify if you're doing some type of performance advertising, do you have the data to support it? And requiring that you maybe upload it and attach it for compliance purposes to that piece. So when you save it to your system, you kind of have a package of material that's audit ready for the SEC. So that not only is the piece been vetted and cleared for takeoff, but if the staff says anything like, well, we'd like to see, the material behind it, you've already got it attached. That it's just part of the audit trail. So we think that's something technology can, and you will see roll out in the next 12 to 18 months. But there are still some hurdles. Technology is not going to be a cure for all of your compliance needs here. You're still going to need experts like Kaufman Rosen to help out. And the reason for that is, most AI models are still narrow, which means they're very good at doing specific tasks, even things like playing a game, but they can't easily transfer that knowledge over to broader context. And that's why the context issue is still the biggest hurdle to overcome when it comes to automated review. The creativity that humans bring to advertising, I imagine if you compare advertising today to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, like Ashley said, back to the 1960s, it's completely different. And can you take the knowledge that you've learned on those earlier pieces and apply it to creative things that people are pushing in the future? We don't know today what social media is going to look like in 10 or 15 years. It could be completely changed. And so whatever technology comes out is going to need to be able to adapt in order to be relevant over the long term. And then I think the last biggest hurdle that technology faces in this industry, and particularly for this product, is trust. If you look at the investment advisory space, a lot of you have built your business on trust, on relationships, that human to human contact. And at some point, people are going to have to get comfortable with bringing technology in to assist them with their business and their compliance here, so that you can actually continue to focus on that relationship with your clients. And that's where we think the biggest value technology will bring is allowing you to scale your advertising strategy in a way that doesn't strain your resources and allows you to continue focusing on what you enjoy doing, which for many of you is probably client relations and other things than advertising review.
Thank you both so much for that. There's certainly a lot of exciting developments in the technology space. And it sounds like both in terms of what exists, but also where technology is going in the future. I know one of the things we kind of talked about leading up to this webinar as well is, as firms and advisors continue to grow, there's also this expectation from regulators that our technology keep pace, both in terms of where we leverage technology, but also in the sophistication of the technology itself. So we certainly really appreciate your insights here. Next, we're just going to touch briefly on Kaufman Rosen's TurnKey Solution for investment advisors that may be looking for assistance on implementing this new rule. So what does that look like? Well, we work through that process in three main phases. In that first phase, we are going to work with you, the advisor, to make several critical decisions. So for example, as Ashley mentioned, deciding whether or not you're going to require approval of marketing materials prior to their publication, or perhaps you prefer to review them on a risk basis post-publication, in which case we can help you decide how often those reviews should take place and what the scope of that review should really look like. Now, After we're finished sort of going over all those different questions and answering those various decisions, we'll move into that second phase, and we'll begin by updating your compliance manual, not only to reflect the obligations of the rule, but actually detailing our specific supervisory structure and the controls that we have in place to ensure we meet those obligations going forward. Now, obviously, there are a few additional resources that you would need, and we're going to help provide those as well, such as a library of template disclosure material. Ashley hit on this a lot as she was going through, how robust the disclosure components of this rule are. And one thing that we think is going to be very helpful is having several of those disclosures templated for you to include in marketing pieces going forward. Now, we'll also provide a marketing review form, which you can use to assess a marketing piece for compliance. And this is also really going to help you satisfy our books and records obligations by evidencing that review. In addition, we're also going to provide a template written agreement. Another thing that Ashley mentioned was that agreement being required anytime we're using these paid endorsements and testimonials, right? And there are certain elements that need to be included in that agreement, which we will put together for you in a template so that you're confident going forward, you're satisfying those elements of the rule. Now, obviously, we'll also assist with making all of those ADV updates that Ashley spoke about. And as we really move into phase 3, we recognize that you can have the right forms, you can have the right controls, procedures, and everything in place, but none of that's really going to help you if your folks are not trained. So as part of that last phase, we can provide both recorded and live training, very specific, to your advisors, and we'll obviously continue to support your compliance team to ensure that everyone feels really comfortable with their obligations going forward. So guys, listen, thank you all so much for attending. I really, really want to encourage you to reach out to Jute. Having seen some of their solutions myself, as Bo was mentioning as he moved his way through, I can certainly see why a lot of their features are really resonating with advisors. So please get in contact with them for a demo and get a chance to see for yourself. If you have questions about Kaufman Rawson's TurnKey Solution, please feel free to reach out to myself or Ashley. We'd love to talk to you a little bit more about what that looks like. And lastly, if you have any questions just about the rule, or you want to discuss a specific area or how it might apply to you or your advisory, look, reach out to anyone on this webinar. Everyone is very knowledgeable, and we certainly all look forward to hearing from you. Guys, we're going to leave our contact information up here and give you a chance to sort of jot it down. You can also reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. Thank you all for attending. Enjoy the rest of the week and the long weekend coming up. Most of all, please enjoy the summer. Certainly after the year we've had, everyone deserves it. Thank you all so much and take care.